Prime Minister Mark Carney and Finnish President Alexander Stubb met in Ottawa this week as Canada quietly sharpened its Nordic pivot, a move shaped by rising trade tensions with Washington and a broader search for reliable partners. The meeting underscored how Ottawa is recalibrating its foreign policy in real time, with Finland emerging as a useful test case for how Canada can diversify beyond the U.S. market. The timing is not accidental. As tariff threats, supply chain pressure, and political volatility continue to shadow Canada's relationship with Washington, Carney's government is signaling that it wants more room to maneuver. Ottawa is not breaking with the United States, but it is clearly looking for alternatives, and that makes small, export-driven democracies in Europe look a lot more interesting than they used to. Finland fits that brief almost too neatly. It is a technologically advanced NATO member, a strong Arctic player, and a country that has spent years building resilience around defense, energy, and industrial policy. For Canada, that combination matters because the current problem is not just trade friction, it is strategic dependence. And that is where the conversation starts to get serious. Stubbs' visit also highlights a broader shift in how Ottawa is thinking about alliances. The old script assumed Canada could lean on geography and the U.S. relationship indefinitely, but that playbook is getting stress-tested, and not in a subtle way. In that context, Finland is not just another European partner. It is a country that knows how to operate under pressure, and that makes it unusually relevant to Canada's next move. What makes Finland indispensable now? In Ottawa this week, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Finnish President Alexander Stubb moved beyond polite diplomacy and into the kind of agenda that signals where Canada wants its next serious partners to come from. The talks centered on defense cooperation, critical minerals, Arctic security, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, aerospace, and the supply chains that could tie Canada more tightly to Finland and the broader Nordic bloc. That list is not random. It maps directly onto the sectors Ottawa sees as strategically exposed, especially as Canada looks for ways to reduce dependence on a single market and build more resilient links with advanced democracies that can actually deliver technology, investment, and industrial capacity. Finland, with its defense expertise and high-tech economy, fits that brief in a way that is hard to ignore. Defense was the obvious starting point, and for good reason. Finland has spent years turning security into a national operating system with a military posture shaped by proximity to Russia and a political culture that treats preparedness as policy, not branding. For Canada, that matters because the conversation is not just about buying equipment, it is about aligning industrial ecosystems, procurement priorities, and long-term security planning with a NATO partner that knows what pressure looks like. Critical minerals were also on the table, and that is where the deal logic starts to get very real. Canada is trying to position itself as a trusted supplier of the raw materials that power batteries, semiconductors, and defense technologies, while Finland is pushing hard on refining, processing, and advanced materials. Put those together and you get a supply chain story that is less about commodity exports and more about controlling the choke points that decide who gets to build the next generation of industrial capacity. Arctic security added another layer, because both countries are now operating in a region that has gone from remote to strategic almost overnight. The Arctic is no longer a frozen afterthought. It is a zone where military mobility, surveillance, shipping routes, and energy security all overlap. Canada and Finland are both trying to read the same map, and the point is not just to share concern, but to coordinate how the North is watched, defended, and developed. The technology file was equally pointed. Artificial intelligence and quantum computing are now treated in Ottawa as core national assets, not trendy side projects. And Finland is one of the few European partners with the technical depth to make those conversations meaningful. Aerospace followed the same logic, with both sides eyeing collaboration in high-value manufacturing, dual-use technologies, and the kind of advanced engineering that can feed both civilian and defense markets. What makes the agenda more important is the supply chain angle linking Canada to Finland and, by extension, the wider Nordic bloc. This is where the conversation stops being about one bilateral meeting and starts looking like a systems play, trade routes, industrial standards, research ties, and procurement networks that can be diversified away from overconcentration. In plain English, Ottawa is not just shopping for friends, it is trying to build a backup architecture that can survive the next shock without begging Washington for permission. The real shift is deeper than trade. Canada's push to deepen ties with Finland and the wider Nordic bloc comes as tariffs and trade pressure from Washington expose a hard truth in Ottawa. Reliance on the U.S. market has become a strategic vulnerability, and diversification is no longer optional. For years, Canada could treat access to the American economy as a default setting, the kind of arrangement that looked stable until it suddenly did not. Tariff disputes have now shown how quickly that assumption can turn into leverage against Canada, especially when one partner controls most of the flow. That is why Ottawa is looking harder at aligned democracies that can offer more than polite diplomacy. Partners with industrial depth, technology capacity, and the ability to build something durable. The point is not to replace the US overnight, because that is not how trade works, and anyone selling that fantasy is gaslighting the room. The real objective is to lower exposure by widening the network, more suppliers, more buyers, more routes, and more policy room when Washington decides to play Karen with tariffs. In practical terms, that means building relationships that are not just friendly on paper, but resilient under stress. This is where the Nordic angle starts to matter. Beyond the photo op, Finland and its regional partners are being treated in Ottawa as part of a broader strategy to plug Canada into frameworks that are aligned on security, standards, and industrial policy. Those kinds of ties matter because they reduce dependency on any single market and make it harder for external shocks to dictate Canadian choices. There is also a blunt economic reason for the shift. Canada's export model has long leaned heavily on the US, and that concentration has left entire sectors exposed whenever trade politics turn hostile. Tariffs do not just raise costs, they reveal weak points, force companies to absorb risk, and remind policymakers that close ties can still mean serious imbalance when one side has more power to squeeze. That pressure is pushing Ottawa toward a more deliberate diversification play, one built around aligned partners that can support advanced manufacturing, clean tech supply chains, and strategic materials. The logic is simple. If one market can be weaponized, then Canada needs more than one lane. It needs a framework that can keep moving when one route gets jammed. In that sense, the Nordic outreach is less about symbolism than insurance. Canada is trying to build a set of relationships that can survive political turbulence, protect industrial capacity, and give it more negotiating room in a world where trade policy is increasingly used like a blunt instrument. That assumption is now under pressure. The summit in Ottawa has landed in a bigger geopolitical frame. Finland's NATO membership, Russia's military pressure in the Arctic, China's grip on critical minerals, and Canada's effort to reclaim leverage in a world where supply chains and security are now the same conversation. Finland's NATO path matters because it changed the map overnight. After decades of military non-alignment, Helsinki joined the alliance in 2023, and Sweden followed in 2024, turning the Nordic region into a more tightly connected security zone on NATO's northern flank. For Ottawa, that shift is not just symbolism. It means Canada is dealing with partners who see defense, industrial policy, and resilience as one package, not three separate files. Russia is the other shadow hanging over the room. The Arctic has become a strategic pressure point, with Moscow expanding military infrastructure and signaling that the far north is no longer a quiet frontier, but a contested corridor. Canada has its own Arctic vulnerabilities, and that makes cooperation with Finland and other Nordic states more than a diplomatic nice-to-have. It is a response to a region where ice, shipping routes, surveillance, and sovereignty all collide at once. Then there is China, which keeps showing up in the background like the producer, nobody invited, but somehow still controls the whole set. Beijing dominates much of the global processing and refining of critical minerals. giving it outsized influence over the inputs that power batteries, semiconductors, defense systems, and clean technology. That reality leaves Canada with a blunt problem. If it wants to build leverage, it cannot keep depending on one country for market access and another for mineral processing while pretending the system is balanced. This is why the Nordic lane is drawing attention in Ottawa. Finland brings advanced industrial capacity, deep security, credibility, and a model of economic planning that fits the current moment, where resilience is more valuable than cheap convenience. Canada, meanwhile, is trying to turn its mineral wealth, energy assets, and Arctic geography into bargaining power instead of raw dependency. That is the real game here, not a photo op, but a search for partners who can help Canada write a different set of rules. The timing is also telling. Global trade is fragmenting, defense spending is rising, and governments are increasingly treating minerals, ports, data, and shipping routes as strategic assets rather than ordinary commerce. In that environment, Ottawa's outreach to Finland and the wider Nordic bloc looks like a hedge against both coercion and isolation. Canada is redrawing its map of trust. In Ottawa, the Canada-Finland summit has moved from diplomatic optics to hard economics, with officials pointing to $2.4 billion in annual bilateral trade as the baseline for a much bigger push into defense, clean tech, and industrial cooperation. Finland brings more than symbolism to the table. Its companies are known for high-end telecom, advanced machinery, cybersecurity, and energy efficiency systems. Canada, for its part, is not showing up empty-handed. The country holds some of the world's most significant mineral reserves, including nickel, cobalt, lithium, graphite, and rare earths, all of which are central to batteries, semiconductors, and defense manufacturing. The AI piece is getting the same treatment, and for good reason. Canada's Vector Institute in Toronto, Montreal's Mila, and Finland's Elements of AI program have become reference points for how democracies can build talent pipelines without handing the whole field to a handful of US and Chinese giants. Vector and Mila have helped turn Canada into a serious research hub, while Elements of AI has become a model for public-facing digital literacy at scale. That combination is what gives the summit real weight. It is not just about swapping memorandums and calling it progress, the diplomatic version of gaslighting with nicer lighting. It is about whether these institutions can be linked into joint research, workforce training, and commercial deployment that survives beyond the photo line. The trade number matters because it sets the floor, not the ceiling. At $2.4 billion, the relationship is already active, but still small enough to grow fast if governments can line up procurement rules, export financing, and research partnerships. In plain English, if the paperwork stays vague, the summit is theater. If it turns into contracts, standards, and timelines, then it starts to look like policy. Nordic strengths also fit the moment because they are built around resilience, not hype. Finland's track record in telecommunications, industrial automation, and defense-adjacent technology gives Canada a partner that understands how to operate in a security-first economy. That is a different lane from chasing the cheapest supplier and then acting surprised when the supply chain gets stress-tested by geopolitics. Canada's mineral advantage is equally concrete. Global demand for critical minerals is rising as governments race to secure inputs for electric vehicles, grid storage, and military systems. And Canada has the reserves to matter if it can parry extraction with processing and downstream manufacturing. The issue, as always, is execution. Reserves on paper do not equal leverage unless they are tied to infrastructure, permits, and buyers. The AI links could be the most durable part of the package if both sides are serious. Vector and Mila have already helped build Canada's reputation in machine learning, while Elements of AI has shown how to scale public education around the technology rather than leaving it to private sector gatekeepers. If Ottawa and Helsinki can connect those ecosystems through joint labs, talent exchanges, and procurement, that would be a real policy move, not just a conference panel flex. For now, the summit has produced signal. The open question is whether the next round of announcements will specify funding, timelines, and legal commitments, or whether this all stays in the familiar zone of strategic language and crawlished handshakes, which agreements will turn signal into policy. Canada's summit with Finland in Ottawa on Tuesday could mark the start of a more institutionalized partnership, with both governments signaling that the next phase is not about symbolism, but structure, funding, and follow through. If the talks translate into standing mechanisms for defense coordination, industrial cooperation, and technology exchange, the relationship could become a long-term pillar of Canada's resilience, independence, and prosperity. That is the real test now. Summits are easy. Institutions are the part that survives the photo op and keeps working when the cameras leave. Ottawa has spent years talking about diversification, but the pivot only matters if it produces durable channels that can outlast election cycles, market shocks, and whatever fresh mess Washington decides to throw into the room. For Canada, the upside goes beyond the Arctic map. A deeper partnership with Finland could help anchor a broader network of trusted partners across Europe and the North Atlantic, giving Ottawa more room to maneuver on trade, security, and advanced industry. In plain English, less dependency, more options, and a little less strategic gaslighting from the usual power centers. That matters because the Arctic is no longer some frozen side quest. It is becoming a test zone for sovereignty, logistics, surveillance, and resource access. And countries that can build credible partnerships there will have more leverage everywhere else. Finland brings hard-earned experience in operating near a hostile border and under constant pressure, while Canada brings geography, scale, and resources that can be turned into influence if the policy machinery actually moves. The next step will be whether both sides lock in concrete deliverables, joint procurement, research funding, defense industrial links, and timelines that can be measured rather than admired. Without that, the summit becomes another polished exercise in diplomatic theater, the kind of event that sounds important until nobody can point to the contract. With it, the meeting becomes the opening chapter of a partnership built for the long haul. Analysts say that is exactly why the moment matters. Institutional partnerships are what turn shared interests into lasting capacity, one Ottawa-based policy analyst said. If Canada wants more autonomy in a harder world, it needs allies that can help build systems, not just issue statements. So the summit's value is not just what was said in the room. It is whether Ottawa and Helsinki can turn alignment into architecture and architecture into power. The next moves will define the pivot.